It was a boom time because of lots of things. You could get something cast in the morning, you could get it machined in the afternoon, you could be running it in the weekend at the dry lakes and seeing if it's working. I think you had all of those elements come together in the right place at the right time.
Hi, everybody. This is Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for joining me once again, and this time we're diving into some hot rod history with author Tony Thacker. His new book is called Rod Mavericks, and it's a compendium of the builders, engineers, racers, and promoters that pioneered the hot rod movement. What began on the dry lakes of the California desert became a worldwide phenomenon, and ultimately a multi-billion-dollar business. Tony is a veteran author and magazine writer, and he's a wealth of information and stories about hot rodding and motorsport and the history of speed in general, really. And the book is out now, so be sure to get yourself a copy. And if you enjoy Horsepower Heritage, do me a favor, rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app. Tell your friends. And if you'd like to support the podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. There's a link in the show notes for that, just one click away. And finally, thanks to my pal Bobby Green of Old Crow Speed Shop for hosting Tony and me for our recording session. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Tony Thacker, author of Hot Rod Mavericks. Enjoy. Tony, how does an Englishman wind up in Southern California and interested in hot rods?
Well, it was luck, really, Maurice. I had a paper route in England when I was 12 years old, and somebody on my paper route took Hot Rod magazine, and I was never really smart enough to understand why or find out who it was and why he would be doing that. But I'd sit on the curb reading Hot Rod, reading about red and yellow cars under blue skies, surrounded by grayness in England and grey skies and grey cars, and it just grabbed me. It was early 60s, probably 62. And, it just grabbed you like rock music or something like that does. I was just enamored by hot rods and the chrome and the candy paint. And I just absolutely loved it.
And what part of England did you grow up in?
I grew up in a small town called Maidstone, which is about 40 miles south east of London, on the way to France, if you were going to France. Not a car town particularly. And I wasn't a car family. My parents weren't into cars. Well, I mean, we had one, but they weren't into it particularly. But it was just something that grabbed me, and it took a while to sort of figure out how to get into the business, because that wasn't, journalism wasn't in our background at all. But my dad was, even though he wasn't particularly interested, he was very, very supportive. And when I first started doing some magazine stories, that came around in a very sort of weird way. A friend of mine was at art school doing some stories for Bike magazine, which had just been launched then. And I think he wrote something about me or one of my motorcycles. And it wasn't very good. I was a little disappointed. And I worked with this old guy, Joe, who would just argue black was white just for the sake of arguing. He was just an argumentative old boy. And he said, well, write to the editor. He said, tell him it's rubbish. And I said, you can do that? And he goes, oh, of course you can. So I didn't know you could even do that. So I wrote to the editor of Bike, who was a guy called Mark Williams, became good friends with Mark, and said, hey, I think this story could have been better if you'd done this or done that. So rather than just saying it was rubbish, I was trying to be constructive and say what he could have done. And Mark wrote back, and I still have the letter. I saw it the other day, actually going through things. And he said, if you're so clever, you write a story. And I was going drag racing with my friend who owned a Vincent, like Bobby's here. And I wrote the story and I got paid. So I thought, God, this is great, because I'm going to the races anyway. Now I'm getting a free ticket. I'm getting on the start line, and I'm getting paid for doing the story. It doesn't get any better than this. And so I turned the story in. I got paid, I think, £25 for that in about 1972. And he said, well, what else do you want to do? And I had a friend who was the the biggest custom painter in England at the time, a guy called Pete Darwell at the company called Mexspray. And so I went and did a story about custom painting, and again got paid. And they sent along a college student, which is what Mark employed, to do the photography, and it was terrible, just really bad photographs. And I was so disappointed. And my dad said, "Well, you can take bad pictures as good as anybody, so I'll buy you a camera." So my dad went out and bought me a little Zenit Russian camera. It was a knockoff of a Zenith. And but I think it was maybe £10 or £20, something like that. And yeah, I could take bad pictures as good as anybody. So now I'm a photographer as well. And I just had that knack of seeing the story. And
how much were you getting paid a week?
No, it wasn't even a
or
week.
By the
then.
story.
I was freelance then. It was probably £25 for a story, which back then would have been maybe $40 for a story, something like that. That was in the early 70s. And I wanted to try and make a career of it. I was training as an engineer and just hated it. And in the latter part, as an electronics engineer, which is even worse, I just didn't like it at all. And but there were really only two magazines in England at the time. There was Bike, when I was still interested in motorcycles, still loved that whole side of the...
Were you in the cafe racer crowd?
No, I was in the chopper crowd.
Oh, okay.
And so we had my friend Robin, who had the Vincent, he and I had a little chopper business when we were 19, I suppose, and I still look back and think, how scary that is to have been making handlebars and footrests and backrests. And so we had a little business, probably lasted a year, but it taught us a lot. It taught us what we were good at, what we liked to do and what we didn't like to do. And the funniest thing was we had this business in an old chicken shed in a village near where we lived. And we decided to pack the business in and go our separate ways, although we still remained friends. But years and years later, I met some biker guys who came the next day to rob us, but we'd already moved out. We'd already robbed ourselves. And so they broke in only to find out there was only chicken poop and all the bike parts had gone. So it was a good introduction, though. It taught us an awful lot about dealing with customers, making things, advertising, stuff that I didn't grow up.
Being your own boss.
Yeah, being your own boss, sort of. Robin was more the boss than I was, but it was good. It was good times, and we built some bikes out of it. Unfortunately, back then, the sort of establishment really didn't like choppers, and we got a lot of bad publicity, and it kind of soured it for us a little bit. Was it just the reputation for hooliganism? Is that what? No, it was really more construction than anything. They didn't understand frame raking, even though we would take a sidecar bottom tree, which had more kick out in it. So we didn't actually cut the frames at all. We just used the right parts to give our bikes a little bit more rake in the front without making them dangerous. But it was good because it introduced me to a lot of people. I mean, it taught me so much. And so I didn't regret it at all. I mean, even though it was short-lived, it was good fun. But nobody had any money in England back then, and there really wasn't any raw material. I really wanted to get into hot rods, but there weren't any. There weren't any early Fords. There were a few early Fords in England, but they were in the hands of old boy collectors, and they sure weren't going to sell it to some youngster who's going to cut it up into a hot rod. So finding a 32 Ford or even a Model A was extremely difficult. They were because especially after the war, the only early Fords we had were Ford Anglias, or what we call Populars,
right?
Which, of course, in America were made into gases. But somehow, I don't know, we were always looking for a 32 Ford or a Model A Ford, and they were extremely rare. And so it was hard to kind of get a start in that business, and nobody had any money. So, you could buy an old Triumph motorcycle for £5 and make a chopper out of it for £10. And so it was very easy to get a start in that. And, we didn't have a garage where I lived, had to rent a garage up the street, had a dirt floor. It rains in England. I mean, lots of things were against you getting off the ground. So it took a long time. And then it took a long time to get a job because there weren't many jobs. As I said, there were two magazines. There was Bike and there was Custom Car, which was launched in, I think, 72, about the same time. But there were only 3 journalists on each magazine. and they were young. They weren't old guys. So, the chances of them dying or leaving was really rare. So it took a long time to get into the industry. And I had no qualifications for the industry. I had not done journalism at school. So I had no training to be a journalist. Still can't spell, can't punctuate. I'm on the Pepper scale of punctuating, where you scatter it on the page and then blow it off, and what's left is the punctuation. And so it was quite tough to get into the industry. But I persevered and did some traveling, came to the US, wrote for Big Bike Magazine, Choppers Magazine, Street Rodder Magazine, and so got to sort of understand the American scene. And those stories were easier to sell in England. Nobody came to the US back then from England very much. Freddie Laker had just started his flying circus, so you could actually fly to the US round trip for £100. And so I came on vacation trips, came on a honeymoon trip and went to the Street Rod Nationals, Bonneville, and was very easy to sell those stories. So built up my reputation and then eventually got a full-time job on a magazine over there, which was really quite eye-opening. It's quite a different world to a normal person's world in England, because back then auto companies had budgets. So we would go on press trips all over the world and just go to fantastic places and do fantastic things, driving other people's cars. It was incredible. Absolutely magical.
I've heard this same story from so many automotive journalists over the years. Everything from back in the days when you could actually write to an editor and get an answer.
Yep.
Which doesn't really happen.
That doesn't happen anymore. No.
And then getting your foot in the door, and then actually having budgets, which
I worked on Custom Car. I worked on a magazine called Hot Car before that, but Custom Car was where I wanted to be. And it's actually, I still work for Custom Car. I still write a column for them. And you know what? Back in 1984, 5, when I was the editor of Custom Car, I paid £75 a page. And guess how much I get paid today? £75 a page. 40 years later, £75 a page, but it doesn't buy you very much anymore. Maybe a tank of gas, and that's it. But yeah, back then, the car companies had budgets and the magazines had budgets. And so the life was, it didn't pay hugely, but the benefits were outrageous. And we would get to travel all over the place and go and see and drive, fantastic cars and get into places that you would normally never get into, which is great, but also it spoils you, I think, for the time when that is not available to you. Like going to Le Mans. I went to Le Mans many, many times with the on the start line ticket. And once you don't have that, I don't need to go. Why would I want to go and stand in the bleachers and watch a race when I was on the start line?
Yeah.
I know that's awful to say, pretentious, whatever, but once you've done it.
No, I get it. It ruins you for
it does.
Yeah.
And but I have such great memories of all those times and people we met and things we did that it doesn't bother me. It was just great. But I used to go with a friend of mine called Peter Stevens, who you might know from designing the McLaren F1, no matter what Gordon Murray says. But Peter was a big Le Mans racer. And so I would always, go with Peter and we'd be right on the grid. And it was just absolutely incredible. Really good fun.
Now, how long have you been in Southern California?
I came here in 1988, so almost 40 years now.
And you haven't looked back?
No, not at all. Not at all. I did on the way here go to Minnesota for a job interview. I'm not even sure if I did the interview anymore, but it was so cold and so deep of snow. I'm thinking I'm not leaving England to go to somewhere that's worse. Just get back on the plane and go to California, which I did. And I was incredibly lucky. I've always been incredibly lucky. And I had a really good friend, Pete Shaporis, who owned a hot rod shop called Pete and Jake's Hot Rod Parts. And Pete had sold that business and gone to work for SEMA, the Specialty Equipment Market Association, or the Speed Equipment Manufacturers Association, as it used to be. And I landed on a Saturday, went to see Pete on the Sunday, and he said, "Oh, why don't you come down to SEMA and have lunch and start networking?" I thought, what does networking mean? I didn't even know what it meant. But I went down, had lunch with him and Dick Wells, and they offered me a job right there and then. They said, well, we're going to launch a new magazine, which eventually became Seaman News. Would you like to be editor? I said, I don't have a green card. They said, that's all right. We'll take care of it. And they did. And I worked at SEMA for almost 10 years. And I got to understand what networking meant.
Yeah,
You
for
know,
sure.
It's not something we really think about in England, but when you're older and you look back, you realize that it's not what you know, it's who you know. And SEMA gave me an unbelievable opportunity to meet everybody, I think from George Bush II to Billy Gibbons of ZZ Top. And, have those people in your contact list and be able to call them when you need something. And from that point of view, SEMA is just amazing. And also, the legislative stuff that they do to protect our hobby is incredibly important. But it was a great place to go and work, and just get to know everybody. It's just amazing. Meet all your heroes, and very few of them actually let you down. I would say 99% of all my heroes I've met, and they're cool.
Yeah, I think that's true in general of the automotive universe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, once you have that thing in common, if maybe you were not a car person and were not yourself enthusiastic, then maybe the reception would be a little less so. And, I'd often heard that different people were grumpy, besides Grumpy Jenkins. And when I met them, they weren't. They were great. And, so to meet people, well, like Wally Parks. I mean, who ever thinks you're going to go and work for Wally Parks? But Wally was wonderful. Alex Exidius. I mean, all of those guys were so, so nice and so supportive, and make a huge difference.
Yeah.
When you're an immigrant, and I was kind of shy. I know it doesn't seem possible now, but I was an only child and very shy, and it took me a long time to learn to go and talk to people that I didn't know. When I was at SEMA, I'd think, I go and talk to them later. Well, I'll go after lunch when they're, less busy. Well, I'll go late in the afternoon when they're not busy. And then I'll do it tomorrow. And sometimes I just never got there because I just didn't have the guts to walk up and say, hey, I'm Tony Thacker. How are you? But gradually you get over that.
Yeah. And you're in Southern California, which is arguably the birthplace of hot rodding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was also very lucky in that Pete's old partner was this guy called Jake Jacobs, who was sort of quintessential hot rodder. And I stayed at Jake's house for the first year or so that I was here. And Jake's a crazy guy and built some wild historic cars. And every Saturday we'd go to Pie and Burger in Temple City, have breakfast, and get in one of his hot rods and go somewhere, whether it was up the coast, down the coast, to Bonneville, to Oregon. I mean, every week we went somewhere. Death Valley. I mean, and Jake knew everybody because Jake, had started working for Ed Roth when he was kid, and Jake, like everybody, was just introducing me to people, and you got into the fold. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they accepted you partly because I was with Jake, I suppose, or if I wasn't with Jake, I was with Pete. And some people like John Botera, who's in the book. John was a difficult guy. He didn't suffer fools gladly. And yet he and Pete were really good friends. And therefore, sort of Pete was vouching for me, I suppose. So when we went to Little John's, I think Pete was working on a car called Limefire then. And so we went to Little John Botera's, and John was, open-armed. And we became reasonable friends. And we worked together at Boyd Coddington's. And I'd, go and hang out with John and, just watch him machine things out of aluminum, which was always absolutely amazing to watch John do that. Watched him make an engine one day. And didn't do the whole thing in one day, but, he was building an engine for Joe Herudka from Mr. Gasket. And so just to watch John carve things out of aluminum was just absolutely inspiring. I mean, how can you do that?
You mentioned Boyd Coddington. Was Boyd difficult?
No. Although we did fall out a few times. I remember once writing that billet wheels were dead.
Oh, man. Shots fired.
Shots fired. Oh, it was worse than that. Oh, man. He called me and read me the riot act. And he said they might be dead, which, of course, they weren't. But he said, you can't say that because I have a warehouse full of wheels and we need to move them. And that was the big difference between English journalism and American journalism, where in England you tend to be sort of more arrogant, more truthful. And I think it's still the same nowadays, certainly in the tabloid type newspapers that we had, is that you try to stir the pot up, as it were. Whereas in America, it's more about business. So, yeah, billet wheels might be dead, but we're not going to say that.
Yeah.
Because we've got to sell a lot of billet wheels. It's totally different. And Boyd was right. I was wrong. I mean, billet wheels aren't dead. Still selling them now. So, and I think 3 times I did that with Boyd. But we stayed good friends, and I actually went to work for him. And again, it was a really good, interesting experience. And I miss Boyd. He was a lot of fun.
I think the Boyd Coddington strain of hot rodding, that style, was really responsible for what we see now, which is the return to the traditional hot rodding ethos.
Yeah, I think so. I think in some ways there was, everything.
It's cyclic, after all.
Yeah, it's cyclic. Every decade or so, things shift. And I think Boyd had had his time. He did an incredible amount for the industry, which a lot of people do not recognize. Got us on the cover of USA Today, Smithsonian Magazine. And some people would say, what does that matter to me? But Boyd was in business. And so Boyd's job was to make hot rods acceptable to people who wanted one, but were on the fence about whether they should really own one. And Boyd and some other people like Bruce Meyer made that acceptable. So, you have to admire him for that.
Yeah, and he was definitely an original.
Oh, yeah, absolutely incredible. Although, people like Tom Taylor or Larry Erickson did the design work, Boyd knew how to sell those projects and go and find a guy who had, back then, $250,000 or $500,000 to build a car. Boyd knew how to do that. And, you have to admire him for that. And he built an incredible wheel empire for a while there. I mean, probably overstretched himself in the end. I don't really know what happened in the end. But, it was still an amazing achievement, which not many other people have repeated. It was incredible.
Tony, you mentioned the book a few minutes ago, and we really should talk about it. It's called Rod Mavericks. This is your latest book. And the idea is these are the movers and shakers throughout hot rod history. These are the pioneers. How many books have you written now?
I think that's number 30.
Wow.
I think. I sort of more or less one every year or two since 1982. Tim Parker at what was Osprey commissioned me to do a history of the 32 Ford. I was building one and realized that there were no books out there that documented the history. And he said, well, why don't you do a book about that? So that was my first book, and it took a couple of years. And I enjoy the process, although not as much as I used to, but I enjoy the process of digging into those stories of people that made a difference in our industry. So when Motorbooks came to me and said, would you like to do this? I said, yeah, that'd be really cool. I'd be interested in that. And luckily, again, through Seema and Boyd and Pete and all the other guys, I knew a lot of those people. So, there's very few people in the book that I wrote about that I didn't know in one way or another. And so to be able to count all those people as my friends and acquaintances was really, really, lucky and amazing.
Well, let's set the stage here a little bit. First of all, why did Southern California give birth to hot rodding?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. You look back at, Henry Ford gave us a Model T. So in building the Model T, he gave every man the means to go racing. Before that, there was no auto racing, there was horse racing. And when the Model T came out, suddenly everybody's got a cheap car, and what are guys going to do? Well, they're going to go race it. So, we have to thank Henry Ford for that. And then pretty soon, people like Bobby Green or somebody else are going to tinker with that Model T, or Ed Winfield for that matter. Let's tinker with this and make this little Model T go faster. And we can do that in 2 ways. We can take stuff off, or we can add speed equipment. And they did both. So you've now got a little stripped down Model T, and you've got a hopped up engine. So now you've got, a really fast little car. And you think back then in the 20s, they were going 100 miles an hour.
And so before the Model T, really racing was the that was the territory of the rich, the Vanderbilt Cup crowd.
Yeah, Duesenbergs, they were rich people. They weren't ordinary people. Ordinary people go and watch, but ordinary people weren't participating.
So the Model T made speed accessible to the common man.
To everybody. Yeah.
And it's so fascinating how many early speed equipment manufacturers, overhead valve conversions or just bigger carburetors or whatnot.
Yeah. There were hundreds of manufacturers because
Frontenac comes to mind.
Yeah, Frontenac. I mean, Miller. I mean, there's dozens of them. And because there were so many Ts, I forget how quickly, but within a few years, there were 15 million Model Ts out there. So they were cheap, and you could go and buy one for $5, and and doesn't cost anything to take the parts off it.
There's an interesting term from these early days. It's called it's gow job.
Oh, a gow job, yeah. That's before they were called hot rods.
Yeah, GOW.
GOW. I no idea.
So it's just an early term
an early term, yeah.
For I heard it had Chinese origins.
Really?
Like the word gow meant
to go
fast or racy or something like that. I'm not quite sure, but
I don't know. I'm married to a Chinese person. I don't think so. I've never heard her use that word.
So the Model T was kind of the go-to platform, and really Fords from then on were the car you wanted, especially after late
20s. Fords and certain Chevrolets in the early days. A lot of people use Chevrolet engines or Chevrolet heads or Peugeot heads. But there were so many Fords that it was just the thing that everybody wanted to go for. And then when Ford came out with the Model A in 1928, I mean, he doubled the horsepower. So now you had a 40 horsepower engine that was the same basic mechanics as a Model T. So everybody understood how it worked, how to make it go faster. So suddenly, now you could put a Model A engine in a Model T frame and go really fast.
There you go.
And that was very popular for a long time until... Not really 32, but in 32, Ford came out with the flathead V8. And initially, it didn't take off. It was unreliable. There were lots of little problems with it. And it took Ford 5 years to figure those problems out. But by 1937, the flathead Ford V8 was a pretty fast little engine. And so you could easily get 85 to 100 horsepower out of one of those. Well, put that in a Model T frame or a Model A frame. Now you've got a hot rod now. You've got a really fast car. And the other thing that we should remember is that, there's a large population in Los Angeles, lots of straight streets to run on, and you've got dry lakes that, not even 100 miles away. So now we've got a place that's sort of 3, 4, 5 miles long that you can go flat out in. And first recorded races were up there. I mean, there's certainly organized racing in 1931, but there were people racing there in the 20s.
We're talking about El Mirage and Muroc.
El Mirage, Muroc, Cuddeback. There were about 5 or 6 different dry lakes that people used back then.
Up in the high
desert. Eventually, it all migrated to El Mirage, particularly when the army took over Muroc for the military during World War II. And close that to the racers. So we still race on El Mirage. I'll be racing there in May.
And Muroc became Edwards Air Force Base, of course.
Yeah. So they've had a couple of reunions there, but not any dedicated racing. But the SCTA still races at El Mirage 6 times a year.
The 1930s saw kind of an explosion of hot rodding in Southern California, where guys really got dedicated to the dry lakes and land speed.
Right.
And we're going to talk about some of those people later. But the war, from your point of view, how did the war influence hot rodding?
Well, sure. It was a boom time because of lots of things. One is you had lots of returning service men and women who were looking for excitement. Whether you think it's exciting to bomb somebody or shoot somebody down, it is. And that was now taken away from their lives. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to go and ride motorcycles. We're going to go race cars. So you have a desire on one side. And then Los Angeles back then was a huge aerospace supplier to the war. So there were, aluminum companies, there were foundries, you could get anything. Well, you can still get pretty much anything made in LA, but it's not as easy now as it was back in the post-war. And then you've also got loads of guys like Ed Iskandarian who have to find a living. What are they going to do? They've been in the military, they're out of the military. What are they going to do? Well, we've got all these kids racing at the dry lakes. Let's make them something. And so people like Ed Winfield, who was pre-war, but I mean, after the war, business for those guys boomed. So you have a market, you have a venue, and you have people needing work and making parts. So whether it's Ed Winfield or Barney Navarro or Alex Exidius retailing them, suddenly there's a massive market there. So now we can open speed shops. So we can start to have little speed shops that sell, either takeoffs or they're selling new parts that people like Vic Edelbrock are making so that the rest of us can go racing. And it's just a snowball effect that happened right after the war, and you had all of the right ingredients to make a really good soup.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about some personalities that you profiled in the book, and one that stands out to me is Barney Oldfield, who,
I knew you were going to say that.
He's kind of the patron saint in a way of the hot rod movement. I mean, he was hired by Henry Ford, in 1903 or something like that.
Yeah.
To race his 999 race car.
Yeah, and a lot of people say that Henry Ford was not really a racer, and he had done a little bit of racing himself. But Henry Ford understood that if you won a race, you could sell a car, and it's that famous old adage, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. And so Henry Ford hired Barney, who'd been a bicycle racer and really hadn't supposedly driven, although he had actually driven, to race his car. And they trashed it. I think, who were they? Winton.
Yeah,
Alexander Winton.
Right.
And, just put him on the trailer twice. And, just established two things. One, that was circle track racing. That was old horse tracks that were commandeered to run races. And because every little town had a horse track. And so they could race all over the country and do it for money, do it for appearance money. And, Barney was probably the first one out there doing that and doing it professionally.
Yeah, and then he went to Daytona.
Yep. Well, back then there weren't, there was a parallel as a land speed racing world, which is a little bit different. And that mainly grew out of Europe by people like Sir Malcolm Campbell.
Sure.
And they're looking for a big flat pace to race, and they discovered Daytona Beach. And Daytona was very good at promoting their beach. So a lot of land speed racing took place in Daytona. And I think Barney went down there and raced the Blitz and Bends. And they were now running, well up in the 100 miles an hour range. And that was before the war.
And we're talking about chain drive and massive displacement.
Massive big 27-liter airplane engines, chain drive, because that was the technology they had. They hadn't developed it like we did. And, a lot of people would dismiss racing. But once you're in the racing world, you do understand that racing improves the breed. It's kind of cliche to say, but a lot of things that we learn about engineering, stress analysis, stuff like that comes out of racing because you're pushing cars to the limit and you want the guy to survive or safety. You want the person to, be there at the end of the race. So we learn how to make those things happen.
Barney Oldfield also knew the importance of being a showman.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the best examples of that, I think, is he had this traveling show where he would race a biplane that was piloted by a guy named Lincoln Beachey.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would go all over the country. It was the barnstorming era.
Yeah.
And Lincoln would fly the plane, Barney would drive the car, and it was sort of a setup from time to time. Like they decided,
it was a setup every time.
This time you're going to win. Next time I'll
win. Yeah,
but
again, it comes back to that thing of also putting on a show.
Yeah,
and you want to thrill the crowd. You want to have a good time. And sometimes we want this guy to win, and sometimes we want the guy in the car to win.
Yeah, so funny. And then Barney Oldfield a lot of people will know him from his association with Harry Miller
Mm-hmm.
and a special car called the Golden Submarine,
Right. Yep.
which was basically an Indy car,
Yep.
but it was enclosed and pretty slippery design, but also a little bit dangerous. You know, if you roll over or something or there's a fire, getting out of that thing would be next to impossible.
Well, back then, safety hadn't developed, and people still thought it was, you shouldn't be wearing seatbelts back then because you'd get trapped in the car because roll cage technology had not come along, fire suits hadn't been invented. I mean, lots of those things, again, came out of accidents. I've got a whole stash of photographs of oval track racing where the guys are just flying through the air completely out of their cars. And back then, Barney would race with a cigar and a, shirt and tie. I mean,
Right.
There was no safety equipment, hadn't been invented. And, again, that's, people go to watch car racing, some of it to watch the racing, but some of it to see wrecks.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you want that excitement.
Mhm.
And another guy that comes to mind for me is Bill Burke, and he's important because belly tanks were his specialty early on.
Yeah, Bill was, in World War II, and like all those guys, they'd been racing at El Mirage very regularly right up to the war until 1941, when you guys were late to the war. And
Better late than never.
better late than never, yep. Twice. But, like all of those guys, they're at war. They can't wait to get home. They're thinking about what they're going to do. And Bill saw these auxiliary fuel tanks, which were strapped under various airplanes, and thought, man, that would make a great race car. So when he got back, again, there was a lot of surplus military equipment laying around LA. And I believe he was able to buy an old belly tank for $5 and put a Model T frame inside it and went racing. And what's really funny is, though, that when I was doing some research on this, we didn't have, obviously, a lot of aluminum in England. We had aluminium, and we didn't have a lot of that either. And so our belly tanks were made out of paper mache.
Wow. Yeah, because the drop tanks on Spitz and Hurricanes were paper mache.
Maybe I had a paper because it didn't matter because you were going to drop it anyway. So would it matter if it disintegrated on the way down?
Right.
So I just think it'd been funny if we'd only ever had paper mache tanks, whether we'd be racing them or not.
I've seen pictures of those P-38 drop tanks just lined up, stacked up, hundreds and hundreds of them after the war.
Yep.
And good luck finding one today.
Well, they are. Bobby's got a few here in this building. And actually, if you go, I was up in Oregon building a museum up there for some people, and they use them for water troughs for cows up there because they split in half.
Yeah.
And so quite often you can go to a field and see half a belly tank buried in the field. But there's lots of different belly tanks. There's different sizes, there's different materials. And so finding the right 315-gallon tank is quite tricky nowadays.
Now, one of the most famous belly tanks is the SoCal Speed Shop Racer. And there was a belly tank racer, but then there was also they built a streamliner.
Yeah, they had a belly tank first.
And this, of course, we're talking about Alex Exidius
and Dean Batchelor, a famous journalist back in the day. He and Alex were partners in a belly tank, and they were quite successful with that. But Dean was much more of a sort of outlooking journalist and had seen some German Audi land speed cars that had raced in Germany. So they took the belly tank body off the Model T and put a hand-formed aluminum body on top of that, built by Valley Custom, Emery, and went out and ran, I think, 189 in 1949, and then 200 maybe in 1950, something like that. So it became the world's fastest hot rod, going much faster than anybody had ever thought, with a Model T frame and a flathead Ford V8 engine. And it was quite revolutionary in its day. But then they rolled that, and then they built a new tank after that, which sort of foreshadowed the coming of the Chrysler Hemi, because Alex was still racing the flathead Ford V8, and his buddy was racing a Hemi, and his buddy beat him.
Right. And after the war, you had the overhead valve Cadillac 331 and then the Hemis. And that really kind of changed the game in terms of performance, and they were very competitive compared to the flatheads.
Yeah. The flathead
had kind of reached its technical...
It reached its peak.
Yeah.
In the sort of late 40s, early, even though Ford still built them till 1953 and even beyond that in Europe. But it was overshadowed by the overhead valve engines that could get more power per cubic inch. So especially in 51 was the Chrysler Hemi came out.
Right.
And suddenly there was speed equipment for that very quickly. So guys were going much, much faster with the Chrysler Hemi than they'd ever gone with a flathead Ford. And then, of course, you get a small block Chevy in 55. It's faster still and lighter. So now you've got lots of horsepower and you've got lightweight, which is, the essence of a hot rod, really.
Yeah.
So that world changed really, really quickly from, within 10 years, from the end of the war to the introduction of the 55 small block Chevy. I mean, just changed drastically.
By the way, I don't want to breeze by without talking a little bit more about Alex Exidius.
Right.
You knew Alex pretty well.
Alex pretty well.
Yeah.
Traveled the world together.
Tell me about that.
Oh, Alex was just one of those lovely, lovely men that I didn't really, I knew who he was, but he wasn't one of those people, because Alex got out of it. Alex, I think, closed the speed shop by 63, went filmmaking, went to work for Peterson Publishing, and was kind of out of the spotlight. He was a man behind the scenes.
He helped found SEMA.
Helped found the Score Off-Road Show with Mickey Thompson.
That's right.
Alex was a behind-the-scenes guy, but he was a lovely, lovely man, and we had so much fun together. We did lots of traveling in SoCal Roadsters, backwards and forwards across the country. Went to Europe, went to Goodwood, went to Lotus, did many trips together, and he was always great fun to travel with. And but what I loved about Alex was he didn't let his passion get in the way of business. So when there was a bill to be paid, you better get and pay it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Alex was, he was pretty cool that way. And I really admired that about him. He was great fun.
And he just passed away not long ago.
Yeah, just passed away, must be early this year, late last year, 103. And, just sharp to the end. And that David Steele and I would go and have lunch with him at Bob's Big Boy in Toluca Lake. And he was always wanting to know what was going on. It's a bit like Ed Iskandarian. I took Ed to the Grand National Roadster show this year. And what's amazing about Ed, he's 103 and he's still interested, still wants to know what's going on, what people are doing. And one amazing episode with Ed, we were at a Eagle Field Runway Drags, which is like a funky little drag race way up in California. And I think Ed was 97 when we were there. So that's, pretty old. And he pulled out an iPhone. I thought, that's pretty cool. Well, he pulled out a second iPhone and he's working both iPhones at once. And I have a photograph of it. And I'm just thinking, that's amazing. I can barely work one. And here's a guy who's 97 years old working two at once.
That's terrific.
And you just have to, and there was one time, and I talk about it in the book, we had his Model T, which he built, pre-war, 37. We had it at the NHRA Museum when I was the director there. And a film crew from England wanted to come and interview Ed, and they wanted him to drive his Model T. So I said to the curator and the sort of car wrangler there, well, they want to come and, film Ed driving his Model T. And they go, good luck with that. It hasn't run in, 15 or 20 years, which it hadn't, just sat in the museum. And anyway, the fateful day arrives. These journalists come from England and the Model T is not running. And Ed had a turkey baster filled with gas. And he squirted it, and we got pictures of this. He squirted it in the carburetor, pressed the button, and the car fired up. So I'm looking at the other two guys going, I thought you said it didn't run. And they just shrugged. Anyway, so he's driving it. And it was just like a time machine for Ed. He got in that car and he was like a child again. And he was telling us all about building the car and driving it on the beach, driving it to Mexico. And this is pre-war, 1937,
wow,
when he built the car. And it was just magic. I mean, it was really magic. And that's, what again has been sort of wonderful about my life doing this stuff is that you get to meet people like Ed and experience those, just memorable moments with people where they do something like that. Just really incredible.
And Ed, of course, is famous for his camshafts. He was grinding performance camshafts very early, and so the Isky cam was like the go-to cam.
Yeah, still is a good cam, and he still makes a lot of parts for the flathead Ford. He makes lifters and valve springs and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's just and what was always interesting about all of those guys, whether it was Alex or Ed or any of those guys, they had no training. For what they're doing. They're not going to marketing school or they're not going to engineering school. They're just getting up and doing it until they get it right. And they were just so admirable from those aspects, is that they had a great work ethic and a great sort of sense. I mean, Alec knew nothing about speed shop business, but he made an incredible go of it and built an amazing brand that is still incredible today, worldwide. I mean, you travel all over the place as I do, and you can see a SoCal logo on a shirt in an airport, anywhere.
Well, and the other thing that's cool is you say these guys didn't have any formal training, most of them, but successive generations of hot rodders have passed on the knowledge. And so, for example, in Ed Iskandarian's case, he learned the trade from Ed Winfield.
Mm-hmm.
Who preceded him.
Yep.
So there's such a tight-knit group there, and passing on the knowledge.
Absolutely. And I think if you went to Ed today and said, "Hey Ed, I'd love to learn how to do this," I'm sure Ed would teach you right away.
Yeah.
If you wanted to make cams.
Yeah,
I don't know who you'd sell them to, but if you wanted to make some, Ed would be there for you. He's a wonderful man. He really is. Such a super, super guy.
Another guy I should mention is Vic Edelbrock, another speed equipment pioneer, manifolds and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, again, a lakes racer who's looking to go fast. So Vic was racing a 32 Ford at the lakes and was running, I think, a Tattersfield manifold and could see some way to make some improvements, but Tattersfield didn't want to make the improvements. So Vic said, well, I'll go and make my own manifold. So he came up with the slingshot manifold, which again revolutionized the way you put two carburetors onto a flathead Ford V8 and changed the industry. And Vic, he had no training as a foundry person or a machinist. He was just a mechanic. And how you turn that sort of basic knowledge into a multi-million-dollar empire, it's just absolutely incredible. Those guys, they didn't have what we had. They didn't have, they had movies, but they didn't have an iPhone. They didn't have as many distractions as we have nowadays. So I think dedicating 27 hours every 24 hours into doing what you're doing was something that they found a lot easier than we do nowadays. And again, because Los Angeles, you could get something cast in the morning, you could get it machined in the afternoon, you could be running it in the weekend at the dry lakes and seeing if it's working. I think you had all of those elements come together in the right place at the right time to build an industry.
Yeah, no doubt about it. How about Frank Curtis? He's an interesting character. Building, like, he's kind of the father of the midget racer, and he built many Indy roadsters, after the war. But he's a homegrown Southern California guy.
Absolutely. Again, and these guys, I think it comes to that thing is that if your peers, like nowadays, if you talk to a young person, they'd be looking at AI and thinking, what can we do with AI on our phone? How can we do this? Well, those guys were looking back then, and they were looking to make a living too. They all had families in that post-war era, and Frank saw that there was an opportunity at Indy. Well, let's make chassis for Indy cars. Why not? And again, he was able to do that because there was a market there. It's like, when the guys invented the go-kart. Ingalls was his name, I think, who invented the go-kart. And then you've got Duffy Livingston and other people who got into the go-kart business. And what you've also got in Southern California, or you had, maybe not so much now, but you had a massive enthusiastic market. And if you look back over the history of all of these things, people could argue it, but a lot of those things, whether you're invented in Southern California or boomed in Southern California, because you had a ton of people with a ton of money and a ton of land to go out and enjoy that hobby. So if you look back at the history of dirt bike racing, you back those pictures of the Mint 400 when there were, 500 motorcycles racing across the desert. Steve McQueen and all those, James Garner and all those people. You had Baja, when Bruce Meyer, not the car collector Bruce Meyer, but Bruce Meyer, the inventor of the Doom buggy.
Right, Myers-Manx.
Yeah, the Myers-Manx. Let's go and drive that 1,000 miles to the bottom of Mexico. Well, there isn't anywhere else you could really do that because it's not the same. So, that's what made it attractive to us too, as English people, to go, well, you can go and do all of those things in your own backyard. Whether we go and do it or not is a different question, but...
There's an example in the book about how tight this community was back in those days. And so Frank Curtis's father worked for a company called Don Lee Coachworks.
Right.
And in Los Angeles, this was back in the 20s. And Don Lee was a Cadillac dealer. Nearby, there was another company called J.W. Earl Automobile Works, and it was a coach builder. So they would take whatever, a Chrysler, a Cadillac, one of the more, Duesenberg, an expensive car of the day, and they would do custom coach work. The Hollywood crowd was very interested in this. That was their clientele, people like Clark Gable.
Yep.
And
Cooper. Yep.
J.W. Earl's son was Harley Earl.
Yeah.
And Harley Earl later became the first stylist for General Motors and established the styling department there.
The styling department, yeah. So, and that all came out of, it wasn't, don't get me wrong, it wasn't all California, but again, you had Hollywood here, so you had a lot of stars, you had a lot of money, and you had a lot of publicity. So there was an instant industry here to modify all of those big cars, which often came just as a chassis with an engine. They didn't come with any bodywork back then. So you could commission a coach builder to put together a body for you. There was companies like Coachcraft that grew out of that. Unfortunately, they never survived very well because those things are fleeting. And, we don't want 10 of them. We only want one. So it's very hard to make a production. And that's the difference between that coach built industry and the hot rod industry, which says, well, we can make thousands of manifolds. I mean, my friend Mike Herman at H&H is still making Navarro manifolds to this day, brand new, still cast in LA at the original foundry downtown and still machined here in LA. I don't think the tariffs are going to make any difference.
No.
Not that we want to get into that.
I don't think there's any such thing as permanence, but that's about as close as it gets.
Oh, that's almost 100 years now he's been doing that. And it's still a good market and still an international market for that. And that's the other thing is that the export of that industry, that hot rod industry, that hot rod ethic, that hot rod product, I mean, it's all over the world. It's Australia, it's New Zealand, certainly Europe. I just shipped my hot rod to England, and we're going to go and race it in Denmark this year at the Romo Beach race, where Malcolm Campbell, tried to set a land speed record in the 20s, and we're still racing on that beach, and racing kind of the same cars. So the export of that is something that normal people would never think about.
Yeah. Now you mentioned Denmark, which is a good segue to another guy I wanted to talk about, a guy named Ack Miller.
Ack Miller, yeah.
A Danish immigrant and got into the hot rodding scene in Southern California in the 1930s and then did all sorts of racing.
Oh, yeah, everything. If it wasn't nailed down, Ack was racing it. Whether it was La Carrera Panamericana, whether it was Pikes Peak. I mean, Ack was doing it all. Again, completely untrained. He and his brothers had a little shop in Whittier, and then Ack ended up on his own. But I mean, it just did everything because there was nobody to say, no, you can't do that. And that's, to get back to how I got here, the big difference that I've found between England and America is, in England, the first answer is always no, you can't do that. You didn't go to the right school, you don't have the right accent, whatever the reason, the answer's no. And when you move to America, the answer's yes. You can do that. Let's go and do that. We don't know how we're going to get there. We don't know how we're going to get to the moon, but we're going. And I think that is just, that's what would attract somebody like Elon Musk to California, that we can do it.
Sure.
And I love that about America. It's fantastic.
There's a great picture in the book of Ack Miller somewhere on the road.
Oh, yeah.
Traveling. Looks like he's going to Pikes Peak, and he's somewhere in Nevada at a mobile gas station. And the car is the Hot Rod Magazine Special.
Yeah, it's probably a Devon with a Mustang engine or something like that.
Yeah, it's a Devon with a 289 Ford in it. Yep. And, of course, Devon, again, it's another Southern California business. Bill Devon building fiberglass bodies that you could purchase and put on a chassis of your choice.
Yeah, on anything,
So interesting.
Well, look at that. I mean, the whole Shelby story of building the first Cobra in Dean Moon's shop.
That's right.
And again, it's a story that probably most Shelby, well, I think nowadays most Shelby purists would get that. But I mean, from a perspective of admitting that we did that in a hot rod shop with a couple of guys like Roy Gamble and his, it's just fantastic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you got to start somewhere.
Yeah. You got to start somewhere. And so let's start in a little shop in Santa Fe Springs. And that whole Moon story is another incredible one. Here's Pop Moon's got a cafe and they decide to build a go-kart track. And they called it Moonza, like Monza, but Moonza.
Right.
So now he's got a cafe with a go-kart track and, it's attracting people to a business that I think Moon's just coming up on its 75th anniversary. I think it was started in 1950.
Right.
So what a legacy. That's incredible. And that's probably one of the most recognizable brands in the world in any avenue.
Moon Equipment, probably their most famous product was the Moon Eyes wheel discs, basically a smooth hubcap, which was an outgrowth of the need to improve the airflow over a car during land speed.
Yep, absolutely. And that would go back to Ack Miller. And some people have said that they were washing machine lids. And when you look at the pictures, they could well have been washing machine lids. I couldn't get anybody to confirm that the first ones, but Ack was probably out there in 1950, late 40s, with a sort of needle nose Model T that had wheel discs on it. But they'd only come from somewhere else. You look back at pictures of Coachcraft, one of the coach builders, and they had ripple discs on their cars before the war. Because they're just hubcaps at the end of the day. But I mean, I think that's probably got to be one of Moon Eyes' longest selling, most recognizable products. And I have a young friend, Ray Slafever. I think he's 17. He just bought a Mitsubishi 3000 GT and he put Moon discs on it. And how cool is that? The car looks great. It looks like a Bonneville car. And, he's just a young lad of 17.
Yeah.
But to him, Moon discs looks great. I always just tell people they're wok lids.
Wok lids.
I had them on several cars, and I had them on a bicycle. And I'd always get stopped at the beach, and people would go, "What are they?" And I go, "Wok lids."
Well, I mean, that's interesting because it was a functional need, and then it became the style.
Yep.
Like it was all about the look.
Yep. Which is basically, what our hot rodding thing is again. There's a need, and then there's a look.
Another immigrant I want to highlight: Zora Arkus Duntov. The father of the Corvette.
Yeah, the father of the Corvette in many respects, yeah. But as a hot rodder, I would know him as the creator of the Arden cylinder head.
Right.
Because as we've talked, the flathead ran out of steam in the early 50s. And Zora and his brother, can't remember his name. But anyway, Zora and his brother were looking for a business. They were immigrants, and they decided to make an overhead valve conversion for the Ford flathead V8, which they did, called the Arden, Arkus Duntov. And Ford wasn't interested. I don't think they even got a response from Henry Ford on that. But, that was his first mechanical foray in the US. And then they sold them to Sidney Allard in England.
Right.
So some of the Allard sports cars came with Arden heads. And then that business didn't really take off. And so Zora was looking for something to do and wrote to GM and said, there's a need here. There's a youth market that you're completely missing. Let's go after this. And so got a job as GM and became chief engineer on the Corvette. And that is really the cliche. The rest is history. I mean, the man did some amazing stuff, got into a bit of trouble, but, sometimes corporations don't want to go where racers want to go. But
Zora was also one of the exceptions to a lot of the folks you profile in the book, in that he did have professional level training. He had been an engineering student. He was a Russian immigrant that his family left Russia after the Russian Revolution.
Yep.
And then they emigrated to
Paris, were they? Brussels or Paris?
I think originally it was Brussels, but then he studied in Berlin,
right,
before the war, and then of course the Nazis drove them out, and he ended up in the United States.
Yep. Oh, thank goodness.
Thank goodness. And the irony of America's sports car really being the brainchild of a Russian immigrant, it's fascinating to me.
But I look at, America as, we're all immigrants.
It's a melting pot.
It's a melting pot. So thank goodness they all came here and created this fantastic world that we have.
Look at Igor Sikorsky, right? Sikorsky Aircraft Company, helicopter pioneer. He was a Russian.
Yeah.
There's endless examples of this.
Examples. So everybody you can think of, and you look back at all of these people, whether it's Vic Edelbrock or Wally Parks, nearly all of their predecessors came from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Typically born here. And in fact, we look at the book, I start off with where everybody came from, and nearly everybody moved here from somewhere.
Yeah. And Zora Arkus-Duntov was responsible for keeping Chevy's eyes on the prize in terms of the Corvette. For example, the Ford Thunderbird was never really a sports car.
It's a big tin can.
Right. It was sort of a gentleman's personal car, if you will, sort of a luxury toy. The Corvette was intended to be a sports car. The early Corvettes with the Blue Flame 6 really didn't measure up. But Zora kept Chevy focused on making it a performance car, and even after the factory sponsored racing ban in the late 50s, which continued on into the early 60s, I think
63 or whatever it was.
But secretly Zora was like, no, we're going to keep the Corvette a sports car. And then later on, the Grand Sport, which was his creation, and the Z06, all of that was Zora.
It's all got that DNA in it, which is just amazing, really, that keeps going. I just saw that they just opened a new GM design center in England, and just came out with a new Corvette concept based on the split window. It's got a split window roof in it.
Oh, fascinating. I have to check that out.
Interesting. Yeah, check it out. Just came announced yesterday or the day before.
Incidentally, I know you know this, but Zora Duntov, from almost day one, wanted a rear-engine Corvette or a mid-engine Corvette. And he pressed them, and they had I think it was called the CERV concept.
Serve 1,
the
Serve 1 and Serve 2.
And he unfortunately, he didn't live to see a production mid-engine Corvette.
Of that. Yeah, I mean, I suppose, that's the one thing about this American car industry, is that it always appears to be, well, we don't really need to spend any money on R&D because we can still sell last year's model with more glitter on it. It always looked that way from the outside, from a European's point of view. Whereas, well, we're not, because those early Corvettes, not fun to drive.
Yeah.
I had loads and loads of those, and they look great, but it's a truck.
Another good example of what you're talking about, where the bean counters in the car industry have their say, is the Ford Mustang, which was not built from the ground up. It was built on the Falcon platform originally, and it wasn't really sporty. It took Carroll Shelby to really make it into a sports-oriented.
Yeah, sports car, race car, yeah. One of my worst got-away stories was a Ford Falcon. I was offered one in England just before I moved here for, I think, $600. And I said, no, they're ugly, because to me it looked like an English Ford Cortina.
Right.
I didn't want to own one. Well, it turned out to be the Alan Mann Racing Falcon that won the Swedish rally or something like that. I don't know. I missed it.
The guy who designed the Cortina was actually also the guy who designed the Edsel.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The Edsel was a massive failure, as you know.
Failure, yeah.
And
well, at least he got some...
they banished him to Ford of England, where he eventually designed the Cortina.
That's really interesting. I have to look that up. Yeah.
I wish I could remember his name right now.
I'll look it up. We'll find it. That's interesting. It's good. Because I had lots of Cortinas.
Now, in terms of Carroll Shelby's success, I think the secret to his success, because he was a marketing guy, but in terms of the engineering, it has to be Phil Remington.
Has to be Phil. Rem, as most everybody then. I didn't meet him until late in his life, unfortunately. I wasn't kind of in that world. Rem was working at Dan Gurney's All American Racers. I had friends who worked there, knew Dan, of course. But I didn't really meet Rem until probably he was late 80s, early 90s, through a friend of mine called Dan Webb in Detroit. Dan's an amazing car builder there and had built a recreation of Rem's early hot rod, like a little modified, they would call it. And so we had a party for Rem at the NHRA museum, which I was running at the time. And he was an interesting guy. Another guy like John Butera, who didn't suffer fools gladly, but somehow or other we got along. The sad story about his car was that he raced it at the lakes when he was a hot rodder in Santa Monica. He lived in Santa Monica at the time. Went away to war, and some guys came to his mother's house and said, "Oh, Rem told us to come and pick the car up and look after it," and they took it, and it was never seen again.
Oh no!
Yep. Yeah, which was really sad. But he moved on and did some amazing things. And it was just, again, one of those seat-of-the-pants mechanics who knew how to make things work. And I think there's a great story of them needing a bulge, maybe for a GT40 at Le Mans, and him going into the parking lot and taking a hood off a car and cutting out the scoop bulge part and putting it into whatever they were racing. I forget the details of it now, but a friend of mine who worked with him confirmed that was the story. But he could make anything.
Yeah, very.
Yeah, I mean, just talented that those guys know what to do, know how to do it through their experience and their knowledge. It's just always totally fascinating and interesting to me that guys can do that.
Tony, a guy who we can't ignore or fail to mention would be Wally Parks, because he kind of tied the whole thing all together in a way.
Yeah, Wally was, I worked with him. I knew him for about 30 years. And worked with him in his last days. I was at the NHRA running the museum, and Wally was late 80s up until he died when he was 94. And Wally had been, not the Barnum and Bailey, I don't mean to dismiss him in that way. That sounds dismissive, but Wally was kind of the ringmaster.
Right.
He wasn't the mechanic. He wasn't really the racer. I think he was the first guy to ever spin out at Bonneville on the first run. But Wally was the organizer. Wally knew how to put it together, and he was incredible at that. And somebody once said he was tired, and Wally goes, "I've been tired all my life." And you could hear it in his voice. But when you research Wally, and as you knew him, he must have worked, again, 30 hours a day in a 24-hour day, because the amount of stuff that the guy created. You can go on to Richard Parks, his son's site, and read Wally's diaries of his early life, and it's just fascinating. And I mean, all they did was work. They ain't sitting there watching TV.
Yeah.
And I mean, to, create what he created, land speed, early SCTA, he was at the SCTA. Then he went to work for Peterson as editor of Hot Rod Magazine. So he's editing Hot Rod Magazine. He's still running the SCTA, and he's launching the National Hot Rod Association all at the same time. It's a bit like Mickey Thompson, running Lions Drag Strip, working at the LA Times, running Mickey Thompson Enterprises. You can't do anything but admire the energy that those people had. It's just, we don't have that nowadays. You don't see it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And Wally was an Oklahoma boy whose family came out to
Goldtree, Oklahoma.
Yeah, and they came out to California in the 20s, and he first went to a land speed event at Muroc in, I think, 32.
Something like that, yeah.
And
31, 32.
And he was hooked.
Yep.
He was an early member of the Southern California Timing Association. He kind of rose through the ranks of leadership there.
Eventually became president.
And then Bob Peterson tapped him after the war when he was starting Hot Rod Magazine.
Bob started Hot Rod Magazine, and obviously Bob went to the SCTA as a sponsor for the very first Hot Rod show, but also as the provider of the vehicles. There was nobody else that had a roster of car owners like the SCTA
Right.
that they could pull together and have the first hot rod show in the Armory. And then Pete wanted Wally to come on board and edit Hot Rod magazine. And it took Wally, I think a few years before he finally decided to go on and be editor of Hot Rod magazine. And, again, that changed the world because that now gave what was basically a Southern California hobby, sport, industry. Suddenly it's got a national voice. And it's not that other people weren't doing it in other parts of the country. They were, but they weren't able to talk to each other because, it wasn't covered on television. There was barely any television. So suddenly Peterson gave them a national magazine. So now we can all speak the same language. And we know that Iski's making a cam because he's got a little ad in Hot Rod magazine. And that's how Ed got off the ground. Somebody saw his ad in a NASCAR team, saw Ed's ad in Hot Rod magazine and called him up and wanted a bunch of cams. And they go, we need them like express. Ed's in business, just like that.
Yeah, suddenly he's getting orders from all over the country.
All over the country.
Yeah.
All over the world. Yeah. I mean, just absolutely amazing. And I think that's partly what helped it grow is that you had a massive, massive market, and it enables you to tool up and make something like a camshaft, and we can sell lots of them.
Yeah. Was this book difficult to produce? I know you had lots of cooperation. There's many archival photos, tons of research, obviously. Now, you've been doing this for a long time, so, it wasn't as if you were turning over fresh soil, but
no, luckily, as I said, I knew lots of the guys personally, so it was easy to call Al Teague and say, "Hey, Al, I want to do a story about you going, 400 miles an hour in a single engine car." Al's a good friend, so lots of those. Alex, having known and worked with Alex for many, many years, it was easy to do those things. It wasn't an easy book to do. It was and interestingly, at the end of the process. Motorbooks contacted me, and they had a fact checker, and she said, I can't check some of these facts because they're not on the internet. And I go, they're not going to be on the internet,
right,
because you can't use the internet to research a book like this because that information came from somewhere else. So you have to either go back to the source of the person if they're possible, and in almost every case we had either the person or a close relative like Cammie Edelbrock. She proofed the stuff on Vic, and thank goodness, because you need that first-hand information to get it right. And I'm sure there are still mistakes in the book. It's not possible that there can't be. But old magazines, old books, bits of old newsreel, you never know where you're going to find the information, but certainly not the internet, because the internet's wrong.
Yeah, original source material is so important, and it's critical. And
so it made it a lot of work.
And you've got also a lot of wonderful first-person anecdotes and stories in the book, which you won't find elsewhere.
You won't find it elsewhere. Again, because I knew those people. I either knew the story or I knew somebody like Bobby Green, who's hosted us here today. Bobby knew some of those people. Bobby certainly has a great archive and is always incredibly helpful. My friend David Steele, he's the director of the American Hot Rod Foundation, and his wife Katie is the most amazing researcher. I can call Katie and say, hey, when was Dean Moon born? Bang. Within half an hour, she's come back and got the date, birthplace, and of obscure people. And you've got to do that. So to use the internet to fact check is not possible.
Yeah. Archives are so important, pouring over thousands of photos, right, to find what you need. And you went to the Peterson for that. Yeah,
Motorbooks set up a deal with the Peterson Museum that houses the Peterson archive. So there's 10 million photographs that came from Hot Rod magazine and all the other magazines that Peterson launched. So we had carte blanche access to all of that stuff, and I can't thank the team there enough who made it as easy as it could be. It wasn't as easy as we thought it was going to be. For example, we went to the Shelby file, and there's 2 rolls of film in the Shelby file, and one of them isn't Carol. So we thought it was going to be easy, but it wasn't. It was a lot of work. But thanks to the fact that they saved all that stuff, because nowadays the value of that material is not what it was. And so a lot of photo collections go in the trash.
Yeah, absolutely. I've interviewed people who had archives from the mid 20th century who they can't find a home for them.
Yeah.
Because it's costly
costly
to archive and preserve them properly.
Yeah,
You need
yeah.
climate control. You need, physical space.
Yeah, and we care about this now. But say you had the world's best archive on horse racing. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
So between us, we probably couldn't name 3 famous horses. So, and I think, we're heading in that direction for our automotive stuff. There's masses and masses of it. I think the American Hot Rod Foundation has 350,000 photographs scanned. Well, we don't need 350,000 pictures. So what's going to happen in 10 or 20 years, which is a big worry. I have a collection of probably 250,000 more photographs. I have no idea what to do with it.
Yeah. Because
nobody really wants it. The general public don't value it. We're in a very small pool. People like myself who write books and or do magazine stories or whatever, and we don't really charge each other for what we have. If I have a picture of somebody that you need, typically I'll give it to you because I know you're not making any money out of this. So how can I charge you if you're not going to make any money? So, and then you'll give me the picture that I need sometimes. And we had to do that with this book. I mean, as deep as the Peterson archive is, there were plenty of holes, like finding pictures of Jessie Coombs. Very difficult, actually, because she was young when she died in that terrible crash. There's photographs of her, but not great ones in some cases. So she was tricky to find pictures. Certainly nothing in the Peterson because she was too young.
Yeah.
Wasn't in there. I miss her. She shouldn't have died in that car crash, but
yeah.
There you go.
The book is called Hot Rod Mavericks. It's published by Motor Books, and the author is Tony Thacker. Tony, thanks for doing this. This was fun.
Hey, Maurice, it was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And I love the podcast. It's great.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. Go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage and become a patron. Don't forget the Instagram and the YouTube channel. Just search for Horsepower Heritage. Lots of good videos over there on YouTube for you. I'll see you back here on Wednesday, May 14th for more of the people and stories behind the machines. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.